Welcome to the Norfolk Sand Dunes podcast. Today we're visiting Holkham Dunes in North Norfolk. This and our other podcasts have been made possible by the Interreg 2Seas Endure project, which has received European Development Fund finance and the Open University's Norfolk Living Dunes project. Today we will join Alex Larter of Norfolk County Council and Andy Bloomfiled, Senior Warden at Holkham Dunes National Nature Reserve, for a walk around the dunes.
So can you tell us a bit about the history of this site whilst we're here? Because we're walking through a pine forest. Do you tell us about when that was planted and why?
So what we're doing here is walking past and through quite an ancient landscape that's been really manipulated and changed by man as well as nature. Initially, the land to the south, the Grays Marshes up to the A149 Coast Road, was a salt marsh. And the area we're walking across now, the Pine Woods, Holkham Meals as it's known, were actually offshore sandbars. It's got like a barrier island system along this. All the coastal sort of processes, if you like, can all be witnessed in quite a small, short walk from where we are at the moment. So going back back to the 1700s, when the Earl of Leicester's family, the Cook family as they're known, they acquired a lot of the land in the Holkham and Wells area, and they started to make drastic changes. They reclaimed land from the sea, they built sea banks, and this starved the salt marshes of the seawater, and the transition went from salt marshes to brackish marshes and then freshwater grazing marshes, and then eventually some of that land was farmed. But the problem was the sea still came in from the north, so in various points, particularly in storm surges. So what happened then was they decided from the 1850s onwards to plant pine trees on the sand dunes to stabilise the dunes, and that acted as twofold really. One was to actually strengthen the dunes and stop the sea breaking through, and also to stop the sand blowing across from the beach onto the farmed fields to the south. And then in more recent years, the same process in the formation of sandbars has happened again in front of the Holkham Meals where we're standing. So we're going to walk out to those in a little while, but there's a series of sandbars that are then turned into embryo dunes, and then what we call yellow dunes. What we're walking on now are more fixed grey dunes, and then in the intervening block of land between the outer yellow dunes and where we are at present has turned into salt marsh. So all these coastal processes can be seen on the walk that we're doing.
In terms of your management of the site, how much of it is in these pine forests, or how much of it is actually further out in the salt marsh or behind it even? Do you have to do a lot of forestry management then?
So for many years the wood was just left to its own devices. The trees were planted in the 1800s, and then you got a secondary layer of scrub form along the southern perimeter. South sides of woods are always better because they attract the sunlight. So you've got deciduous trees and mixed sort of herbage all growing along that south edge, which adds to the biodiversity.
Yeah.
And for many years, nature was left to do its own thing. But in more recent years, we've realised that there's quite a lot of invasive holm oak, which is an evergreen species from the Mediterranean. These were planted all around Holkham Estate from the 1700s onwards, and they naturally spread. Birds like jays collected their acorns and brought down here, and even some of it was planted down here. But it's a very invasive species in the respect that nothing much grows underneath it, and it will spread quite rapidly on the sand dunes.
The holm oak Andy mentions is also known as holly oak, and at first glance it doesn't look like your typical oak due to the holly-like leaves. They have small spikes and don't have the undulating leaves that you might be accustomed to in regular oak. Holkham dunes are known as Holkham meals locally, and Andy mentioned these earlier. He references the meals in opposition to the yellow dynamic dunes on the dune islands that you can see as you walk out across the marsh and towards the sea.
Yeah, that's
So that's one. Also, plants like sea buckthorn is another one that takes over the dunes.
yeah.
And the reason we have to do a lot of the management is on the sand dunes for invasive species is because the grey dunes and the yellow dunes are very important for all manner of flora and fauna.
Yeah, so we'll get to that in a minute, but we've just now, from the horse path that's guided us down to the front of these grey dunes, there's a big sign here. Can you tell us about this dogs on lead sign and why it's important from 1st of April to 31st of August?
So in recent years, as in the last 20 years, the number of visitors on the North Norfolk coast has got astronomical compared to previous times. Holkham is obviously a really busy place, a fantastic beach, the shallow waters for bathing. You've got Wells and Burnham Overy at either end, so it's this fantastic sort of 7-kilometre frontage of beach. And obviously it's very popular, but the one thing, as we're part of a national nature reserve, that was made a national nature reserve in 1967 for many reasons, but one of the reasons was to try and protect nest and shorebirds. So birds like oyster catchers, ring plovers, little terns, common terns, they're all ground nesting birds, and they all like bare shingle on the sand or the very early formation of sand dunes. This is where they've always naturally nested, but of course the pressure they receive from visitors, particularly with dogs, if they're not protected, the disturbance can be catastrophic. So certainly within the last 20 to 30 years there's always been an effort to protect sort of colonies of terns by putting fences around where they nest. But what we've seen in the last probably 5 or 6 years is ever increase, even more numbers of people coming down here, and many more dogs than there used to be in the past. Everybody seems to have not one dog, but sometimes 2 or 3 dogs. So the amount of dogs that are now coming to the coast is far more than it ever used to be. And dogs, because they're running about loose, they can get into the colonies, they can either eat the eggs or the young, or just the presence is enough to disturb them, and the birds give up nesting. So we were faced with a dilemma of how to deal with this in such a way that we weren't penalising everyone who was coming here with a dog, but we were trying to be more firmer and sympathetic to the needs of nature. So we decided last year that we'd have to have, not actually banning dogs, but to have zoned areas where dogs could and couldn't go, and particularly in the nesting season, which we sort of deem as April to August. April's when the first ring plovers are usually starting to think about laying their eggs, and August is usually when, sort of like the second broods, they're starting to think about fledging. So that's quite a long period, and within that period there'll be oyster catchers nesting and little terns as well. So that was the main time period and the main areas that we wanted to keep, dogs on leads to help protect them.
You're listening to the Endure Holkham Dune podcast with Andy Bloomfiled, Senior Warden at the Holkham National Nature Reserve, and myself, Alex Larter, Project Manager for the Endure project for Norfolk County Council. At this stage, if you have followed our ramblings as you have walked, you should be arriving near where the signage we discuss is located. However, if you are taking this walk outside of the 1st of April to 31st of August period, you will not see the signs as they are temporary.
A number of people, walking through here. It's interesting you mentioned dog walkers, because with Endure we did some surveying at the start of our project, and what came back was that between 40 and 50% of people visited our 4 coastal dune sites for dog walking. And so if you're then extrapolating that to the number of visitors that we get for sites yearly, you can say, well, if 45 to 50% of those people are actually coming to walk their dogs, you can say, well, there's at least that certain number of dogs. So I don't know, how many visitors do you get at Holkham? Do you know for? Well,
there's various numbers been bandied about, sort of 500,000 visitors in a year, but my personal belief is because somewhere like Holkham has got lots of different exit and entrance points, there's probably a lot more than that.
Yeah.
But what we do know is in recent weeks we've been doing fixed arrivals at Lady Anne's Drive and people coming onto the beach, and we've been counting 400 people in an hour, you know,
Wow.
and probably within that 400 people there's been 200 dogs.
Yes.
And that's 1 hour on one day at the weekend, you know.
Yeah. So that's exactly where I was coming to. So we were looking at, you know, if you're saying there's 500,000 visitors at least, then you're saying there's actually at least 250,000 dogs visiting the site. So, you know, this kind of answers the question, oh yeah, but it's my dog, one dog. But actually it's not just one dog, it's 250,000 dogs in an area where you've got how many nesting terns,
so
for example?
little terns, for example, this year we may have anything in the region of about 10 pairs of ringed plovers between Wells and Burnham Overy. We may have 15 pairs of oyster catchers, but little terns maybe 20 pairs.
Yeah.
In one colony at Holkham, you know.
So I think that's kind of a good way of putting the imbalance between the number of dogs coming in terms of populations and, you know, the chances, and that gives an idea of the disturbance it can cause in terms of, you know, disproportionate numbers.
But the one good thing you can say, even from today, we've been walking 10 minutes.
Yes.
And every person we've seen with a dog today, they're on leads.
They're on a
There's
lead,
one
yeah.
in front, there's two in the distance, and we passed some previously. Well, having said that, there's one over there that's not.
We saw one
actually,
over.
That is on a long lead.
We saw one earlier that was off a lead, but I must say, out of the 50 dogs we've seen, there was one off a lead.
Yeah.
Whereas I remember 2 years ago, before COVID, when I came, we would walk around together, and then we'd see 90% of dogs were off leads.
The message has been, when we put out a consultation notice to say what we were planning upon doing, we got quite a lot of negative response. Not an overwhelming amount, but some. And to be honest, for us on the ground, we thought it was going to be a complete and utter nightmare to manage. But once we'd got the signs up, the other difference is this year we've employed pretty much full-time beach wardens who are on the reserve on the beaches in that period from April through to September. So they're not only helping to protect the nesting birds and repair the enclosures, but they're also here to instruct visitors and guide them in the right direction with any dog issues. But to be fair, in the 10 minutes we've been walking, we haven't seen a beach warden, but we've seen quite a lot of dogs, and they're all on leads. Yep. So my personal take, even in this short period, 2 or 3 months, the message has got out there, and people are doing what they're asked. Obviously, you're always going to get the minority who don't, but from my point of view, as someone who's been here a very long while, I think it's a very positive result, and one I didn't think would be achieved quite as quickly as it has.
Yeah, I mean, I'm impressed. I think also the signage is very positive. It's not a banning on dogs. It's actually a positive action, call to action. So dogs on leads. You know, it's not saying dogs can't come. It's actually.
So we're not banning dogs.
Yeah, exactly.
We're still welcome to visitors with their dogs, and in fact, you know, there's many parts of the reserve where people can go, and even parts of the beach people can go with their dogs off leads.
Yeah.
The only area we've actually tried to stop dogs completely is a very small area between beside Wells Channel, where there's a haul out of common and grey seals, and also that particular area is the most visited part of the beach by a large concentration of beachgoers, particularly young children, because of proximity of the car park at Wells, and we did have quite a lot of issues there with dogs fouling, people being bitten or attacked, from only a minority but some, and also the seals being constantly disturbed. So the idea there was, we'll make this a dog free zone.
Mm-hmm. So now we've moved on a bit. We're still following the horse path. Is this also now the National Coast Path?
So we're on the National Coastal Footpath, and this is the area where we're obviously with the expansive sands, we're quite popular amongst the horse riding fraternity, but again there are parts of the beach where we welcome the horses, where there's less damage, and places where we don't welcome them, or they're less desirable and their impacts are detrimental to the site. So we try and keep them into one specific route onto the beach, and then onto the foreshore, and all's good. But here you see This is like the salt marsh in front of us here.
Yeah.
It's a very sort of fragile environment. If you were to use vehicles or horses or lots of people, you would, you know, really spoil the nature of the vegetation. So another thing we try and do here, as you'll see, we try and guide people away from the salt marsh, and you can see it's a classic example of a path that's been regularly used. But if it weren't for the people, that would be, the salt marsh vegetation would carry on all the way across. So this is one of the challenges ahead of, you know, how we now manage the salt marsh, because, you know, salt marshes in North Norfolk are an incredibly valuable habitat. We've got one of the finest salt marshes in Western Europe. You know, the flora and the fauna is all very specialist, that's adapted to live in these, you know, constant fluxes of tidal change. So
Thank you for listening to the Norfolk Sand Dunes podcast. This podcast was recorded, produced and edited by Kim Hammond and Chris Bonfiglioli for the Open University Norfolk Living Dunes project. Special thanks for this podcast go to Mel Gillings of Norfolk County Council, Professor George Revill of the Open University, and the Holkham Estate and National Nature Reserve teams for their support and participation. We hope you enjoyed learning more about Norfolk's wonderful dunes. For more information, please head to www.endure.eu.com. And remember, please respect and protect your dunes and enjoy wildlife responsibly.